Доброе утро, коллеги.
Good morning, dear colleagues. Today we meet Mr. Shuvalov, first Deputy Prime Minister of Russia. We have just discussed with Mr. Shuvalov. We can immediately start with questions without any introductory words because our time is limited. It's only until 11 a.m. We have about 1 hour and 10 or 15 minutes. Okay, the first question is already there. Introduce yourself. I'm from China. Mr. Shuvalov, as far as you know, sanctions were introduced against Russia, and they are still there, and it's not so bad. Perhaps Russia should focus on restructuring your economy in favor of real economy, processing, industry, innovations. Perhaps you have already reached certain results. Please tell me what achievements you have already made and what are you going to achieve in the future. Good morning, and thank you for inviting me. We always say pretty much the same thing. There's nothing good about these sanctions because it's unfriendly, unpartnership-like attitude from countries whom we treated very differently in the last couple of decades, and that's why sanctions are not good, of course. But in practical terms, it's a very good agenda. When I work in an isolated mode, and when I understand it's off the record, the worst thing the Western partners can do for us is to immediately lift sanctions. And that's a very complicated situation for the Russian society, market, and the government when the price for oil behaves as it does, and there are many fears and lack of understanding about the development of the situation, whether economy is going to go up or down. And when Western partners keep threatening us and say, you know, if you don't normalize the situation, if you don't improve the situation, then we have other sanctions in stock for us, and we shouldn't relax, and we should be doing exactly what you did. You said what we are, or were saying in the government. We need to focus on the structure of our own economy. We won't get any outside benefits or help during the positive situation in the market. We were able to pay our debts and accumulate some gold and currency reserves. Whether we will have that in the future, we are not sure, so we have to rely exclusively on our own forces. And I hope President Putin will be a president for another 10 years. Then we will have to make sure this is the period of our development when we have to rely on our own forces and also the help from partners with whom we have not interacted as much as we should have, especially those in the Asian region. Good morning. I'm always glad to see you. And to follow up on the question of my Chinese friend, what are the main infrastructural projects that you have in Russia, and where will you get the funds for it, the money for it? If financial markets are almost closed for you, people misunderstand the structure of our budget when they talk like that. And the plans that we had even in 2012, and initiated by the president and then strengthened by the government, projects. It's not only railways, airports and airstrips, sea and river ports. It's all in our government programs. Since we lack some of the revenues that we hoped for, some of the elements of that program or some of the projects from those programs will have to be delayed a little bit later, for example, way beyond 2018, 2020. But we never meant that these projects are going to be exclusively financed by foreign debt or our access to foreign capital. Okay, there's nothing good about our growth, I'm frank with you, but even with the prices for energy resources, the growth of about 1% is no growth, but the revenues of the federal budget and the expenses of the federal budget, these are astronomical numbers. If we compare with what we started in 2000 and what next year it's going to be 15 trillion rubles, our expenses from the federal budget. No loans would cover our expenses on infrastructural projects. Our program of loans is very moderate. We are not increasing the state debt all that much, the public debt. We discussed this year whether we need to increase taxes, whether we need to use golden currency reserves for infrastructural problems, but we kept the basics of our macroeconomic policy as they were. We keep our reserves. If the price for oil drops significantly, we continue to finance the expenses of the federal budget by taking part from the reserves to compensate this drop of oil price and continue to fully finance our state programs. If the situation is even worse than we predict in the next couple of months, then we have a scenario according to which we cut the expenses on the government programs by 10%, but it's not half. People think it's something significant. Yes, it's hurtful, it's a delay of some projects, but if it's a very bad scenario compared with the plan that's going to be approved by the State Duma, it's going to be minus 10% of the state programs that we plan for the next 3 years. But there's nothing there related to the outside markets, because our loan program that we approve together with the budget, we don't even use all of that, and we don't increase our foreign debt. It's quite low. Good morning. And to follow up on Mr. Dudkevich's question about infrastructural project, let me ask you a question about World Football Championship. You are responsible for that project partially. I have a question about the city of Kaliningrad. We have a stadium there that's built on the marshes, and even the Germans did not build it. They spent billions of rubles, and there are many such decisions, and the stadium is not there yet. How such decisions were made? Well, no decision was made on Kaliningrad on the 28th of October. We are going to have a meeting of the committee, and we're going to discuss all the organizational issues of this zero stage. We have two complicated stadiums where they have complicated soil, Rostov-on-Don and Kaliningrad. In Kaliningrad, the project is most difficult. When we started this project about the World Football Championship, we didn't just mean football championship. We wanted to upgrade our 11 cities which are going to host it in terms of infrastructure and attracting the tourists. And in Kaliningrad, the governor convinced us that we had to take that site in the middle of the city, this isolated lot of 200 hectares, spend a lot of money to upgrade it, remove water from that, and then put the stadium in the middle so that later we could create a new center for Kaliningrad. But there is no design there yet for that plot of land, and we are not sure the stadium could be safe there. We offer the president to make a decision, and we are running our final consultations with FIFA and Blatter. We want to decrease the number of seats at the stadium, and perhaps we'll even use a regular project of revamping the existing stadium. It's not very convenient because there are limitations there in terms of the lot, but at least it would be enough to host games of the championship and without extra expenses. We're expanding the range of our discussion, and now we're talking about sports. Okay, Mr. Shargunov next. Mr. Shuvalov, good morning. In the media, there are a lot of discussions about the so-called Rothenberg law, as they call it. From the state budget, they want to compensate the losses from the property of Russian citizens abroad that was arrested. Could you give your assessment? There is no such law. It's a draft law, at least it's been discussed in the first reading. You spoke about social expenses. Again, a lot of insinuations about cutting the hospitals, doctors and beds in the healthcare system of Moscow. What's your professional assessment of the situation? Thank you. Well, you should ask the mayor of Moscow about Moscow. It's his responsibility. Now, about this draft law, if you read all the draft laws that they have at the State Duma, introduced by all the initiators, you will be in a very bad mood if you read all those draft laws. Some Russian government draft laws are not improving your mood at all. It's just one of the initiatives. This is my attitude. And when this situation started in spring with all these sanctions and that tough rhetoric from the Western partners, deputies had a lot of initiatives. Remember that draft law on Visa and MasterCard. This was not the initiative of the government. Together with the Presidential Executive Office, we were able to calm it down a little bit too, because the Duma deputies just wanted to ban everything that's related to it. And there are many such initiatives right now, but listen, it just testifies to the fact that the MPs have their own, or members of the parliament have their own will, and they use their constitutional ability, and the government and the Presidential Executive Office should work with them, or agree with them or not. In the current form, this law is very bad and damaging. Can you use this idea somehow to create something that you could perhaps claim some assets of foreign partners if they restrict our assets in their territory? That's another idea. But this should be justified, this should be explainable, not just some people who got their property arrested. Then many people will go to foreign jurisdictions and ask them to arrest their property so that they get some money here from the Russian budget. People are never happy, especially about healthcare and education. About your question about Moscow, I'm not going to defend the mayor of Moscow or defend his position. You'd better ask this kind of question to him. He has a clear program for the social sphere in Moscow. But you have to realize this. In Moscow, they have so many hospitals for some specific groups that it's a surplus, really, for the population of Moscow. Many hospitals are fenced, are closed, they get financing. These hospitals may belong to ministries or big state corporations like Russian Railways or Gazprom. They are good hospitals. They could have serviced through a system of obligatory medical insurance or voluntary medical insurance without ministerial limitations, industrial limitations. They could service a lot of people. If we look at the number of people and doctors and hospitals and population of Moscow, there is this discrepancy. If Sobyanin is able to not just cut jobs and fire people and shut down hospitals and daycare centers, but if he he would allow us to get access to high-quality hospitals, that would be good. And I spoke with him many times. He is not just cutting expenses, and that's it. He understands that Moscow is a very complicated metropolis, and the development program should be as good as permanent social expenses. It's not a charity institution. It's a complicated biological mechanism. I mean, Moscow is.
International Studies, Washington. Очень приятно, добрый день, видеть вас, Игорь Иванович.
Economic situation in Ukraine today is catastrophic. You need a huge level of international help. Europe does not have enough. Russia doesn't have enough. The US doesn't have enough. International Monetary Fund may not have enough. But they should all be working together. Do you think that the current situation could be the foundation for cooperation between Russia and the EU with different partners on this issue? I mean, international help to Ukraine. Well, I think that Russia has always used this as basis of its thinking, and the absence of such joint work is the result of actions of the US and the EU. This agenda was not born in Russia. You know, we had quite complicated relations with the government of Yanukovych. Other people who spoke with you and who are responsible for the political process, some people think that Yanukovych was this pro-Russian president, that he, as if he was a very serious partner with us, with some productive dialogue. No, it's not true. When we created the customs union, I was given this task to go to Ukraine and talk to the presidential office in Ukraine and to the president, to the government. Ukraine was pushing us towards signing an agreement about the free trade zone in the CIS. This was their initiative. We had to replace many bilateral relations by one big agreement in the CIS, but actually Ukraine was pushing us towards it, and we understood why, because in parallel they had negotiations with the EU about the comprehensive free trade zone, and they thought they could take everything they could from the CIS by arranging with us. Then they will open the borders and bring down the custom duties to zero from the EU, and then they will be in the best position in the overlapping zone of these two circles. They will get the best place, but others are not idiots, and they all can calculate. And I went there to explain to them what the customs union means, why we need the unified customs territory. Before the customs union, Russia already had the agenda to form a common economic space with the EU. We discussed 5 freedoms, and one of them was one of the values was common economic space. But at a certain point, we understood that to create this common economic space, you have to do it between one union and another union. Even if in our union we don't have 500 million people, but at least 170 million. That's a huge space. That's a huge economy. It's stronger than Russia alone. 140 million, different levels. And we would say to Ukraine, it would not work like this for you to participate in all formats. You will have to make a choice. And we explained that you would have a conflict with us at a certain point. And they, when we had this professional, non-political discussion, they understand. But they go to the media and then they spin a totally different agenda. They thought that something would happen and they would be lucky and it would work out with them. Since 2009, I worked with Ukrainians, then their president and government changed, and again I went there and we explained them that Ukraine cannot exist in all formats at the same time. And when it became hard in Ukraine, President Putin offered a program of cooperation. We chose the most promising industries where it would be good for Russia to cooperate with Ukrainian companies. Big loans were promised, $15 billion. We had an agreement on the gas price. But even then, we understood that that agenda could not be implemented without interaction with the EU to restore the economy, to pull it out of misery. It would be hard. We understood it's going to be hard work for everyone, and why somebody had to pull the Ukraine so that it immediately signs that agreement. I understand that those were some kind of mega political goals, because there was no economy as at the foundation of that, and the US will not pull Ukraine out without us, and vice versa. And it's a complicated project, and we need to work together. And when our friends from the US and the EU come to their senses and would understand that you need to do some business and not blame each other, then things will go ahead. Thank you, Mr. Skidelsky.
Skidelsky. I'm from the UK and a member of the British Parliament. You talked about infrastructure programs at the beginning, and I want to just ask you to consider this, that the development of Russia can't be entirely driven from the top. There has to be a private enterprise has to play a major part in that. And I wonder whether one of the failures of the modernization program has been the absence of a sufficient incentive for private enterprise to build a more diversified structure in Russia. Over most of the post-communist period, there has been a net flight of capital from Russia over much of it. I don't know what the cumulative balance is, but certainly a lot of capital has been exported from Russia. And this is not just Russians, but foreigners haven't wanted, not just foreigners, but Russians haven't wanted to invest sufficiently in Russia. Now, what can the Russian government do to make Russia a more attractive investment venue for both Russians and for foreigners?
First of all, our agenda is to make Russia more attractive for the Russians. This is our agenda, and all those talks about bad investment climate and something to do in order to invite more foreign investments, those conversations, those talks are no longer relevant. Because come to us and invest, actually, we do not force anyone. We have a lot of foreign investors who would show very good results. And if you talk to businessmen from the United States and UK who are working in Russia, they show very good results. There are quite few projects which are a failure. In most cases, these projects are a success. And this is not only about oil and gas. We have food industry, we have agricultural projects. For instance, production of grain, of wheat. There are a lot of different other industries where foreign capitals are very welcome. And we have certain research that those who are working in Russia and those who invest in Russia and those who have never worked in Russia, they have different impressions about Russia, different vision of Russia. Those who are investors into Russia, they treat Russia absolutely differently. In your words, I see the truth about the following, that Russians exported capital in more volumes than the foreigners, just really after the collapse of the Soviet Union and after the dire years of 1990s. People who could earn, those who had certain money, and so these were not grassroots people who even couldn't make both ends meet, but those who could actually save up some people, they invested into something, and then they exported the money, and after that they brought this money back as a foreign investment. And we have discussed that more than once. As for your statement, at least you said that one of the failures of the modernization program of Russia, this is not true, I think. We didn't have any failures since the year 2000. For 14 years, Russia did more than any other country, and our modernization program is in the full swing. We had a very complicated period since the year 2008, when the crisis broke out. And at that moment, really, the modernization agenda was very relevant, very topical. Mr. Putin was the prime minister at that time, and thanks to the money accumulated, we could do something. We could deal with such huge enterprises and develop them, such as Avtovaz. And the assets and the money which were not used by Avtovaz, actually, we delegated to the municipal authorities. We helped to optimize the headcount at huge enterprises. And then, after the oil prices went up, everyone relaxed, the agenda changed, but the modernization actually was most topical in the most difficult period of the crisis. As far as we feel some pressure from outside and the oil prices go down, those factors drive the government to promote the modernization agenda. And actually, you know that there is a big deal of unity in the people who surround Putin. And the situation is quite calm. Under these conditions, we have to promote modernization. What should be done? I think that Mr. Putin will tell you personally what will be done, but he instructed us to develop the agenda so that the upcoming decade is the decade of economic flourishing. We are working on that. After we see the political consolidation around the president, when he is very much popular, there should be more freedoms in the economy. This is his instruction. I cannot disclose all the details. Once the agenda is ready, Mr. President will tell you about that. Thank you. My name is Ploto Shmutovai. I'm from Tokyo. I have a question about the development of forest. And certainly, a lot has been said about that. After the Asia-Pacific Summit, Japan is very much interested in the development of forest. A new minister for forest development was appointed. But after the crisis in Ukraine erupted, the plans for the development of forest changed. Actually, my question is whether the Ukrainian issue affects the development of the forest. This is question number one. And question number two. Do you still preserve the plan to move the capital to Vladivostok? Second capital. That second capital of Russia should be in Vladivostok. Capital number one is Moscow. There is no such a plan to move the capital of Russia to Vladivostok. We never had such a plan. Actually, there was a smaller plan to move the ministries and different departments from the downtown of Moscow to the suburbs, and we actually refused to do that because it is too costly, but no one wants to move to Vladivostok. At least I do not know anything about that. As for the development of Siberia and forest, our plans remain intact, and against the backdrop of worsening relations with the EU, at least our relations are tested by the sanctions. When we chaired the Asia-Pacific, and we then wanted to turn our face more to the east, because actually mostly we traded with the EU, and some of our territories are in the Pacific region too, and we actually saw that our trade turnover with China was not too big. Certainly, we did not want to invite the Chinese to all the strategic areas and industries, including the mining industry. But since the year 2012, we resolved that we would like to invite the investments from the East, and we are not. It is not that we will trade less with Europe, but we wanted to increase our commerce relations with the East. And certainly, we facilitated our trade relations with Indonesia, with China, with Vietnam, with some other countries. Whatever is going on all the factors which might facilitate our trade relations with the East would also somehow speed up the development of Far East. And Japan actually may get a very serious foothold there. Japan wanted to invest into agriculture, to the production and processing of soya beans, and there are more investors. Once Japanese are reluctant to do that, for instance, we have more investors from Israel. And for instance, they are jumping on the projects which the Japanese wanted to develop together with Hokkaido Bank. So we are going to offer to other partners to develop those projects, and we have to rely on ourselves. We have a huge potential internally, domestically, so this is the high time to wake up. Mr. Prokhanov. Mr. Shuvалов, this is an open secret that the Russian economy is going through enormous difficulties. The economic growth is almost reduced to zero, and we are facing recession. But do you plan some investment project for Russia, huge investment project for Russia, and for instance, probably change of paradigms, as Ms. Savchenko announced when she suggested that the investments should be promoted. So that's a very good statement. You hit the bullseye with your question. When the Ukrainian crisis erupted again, and when our domestic agenda was filled with new factors and new circumstances which were not there 2 years ago, if we remember, for instance, May 2012, Mr. Putin was inaugurated. He announced his May decrees. And let me touch upon the economic component. When preparing for the presidential elections, he had developed those decrees, he had developed this economic agenda. But after the political developments changed the situation dramatically, the agenda was split into two parts, the political one and the economic one. And actually, the presidential decrees of 2007 are no longer relevant, and economic opportunities are very much different. And this will last for not forever, certainly. So president is going to stay in power for 10 years, at least I hope so. And within that period, he will have such an opportunity to invite more investments and change the economy for the better, when he may use this economic drive and speed up the economic growth. At that moment, we see the clash of two political courses. Some people say that this is the moment is opportune. We have to remember what used to be under Soviet Union. We're Russians. We can mobilize the forces. We have some accumulated potential. We have certain sources, and we can borrow from our friends who have not sanctioned us yet. And we may provide for kind of breakthrough in order to modernize our industry and our economy. And there is a different approach against the background of political consolidation and high popularity ratings of president. Certainly, we have a lot of poor people, but the poverty is no longer dire. And the objective, which was stated by Mr. Putin to fight poverty, many people feel they are poor, but you can see that the life of people changed for the better. So people either are paid, probably not well, but this is not on the survival level. And those who get promoted, for instance, whether they work for the state-owned enterprises or whether they work in different federal ministries and departments, they will not have to risk when, whereas, for instance, in the 1990s, people either had to go to the market to trade there, or they had to find some cheaper food products, although they probably would be PhD, etc. But right now, the poverty is not so dire. And the mobilization is not imposed from top. We may use the authority of the municipal agencies, and we are backed by the People's and Popular Initiative in order to modernize the economy, but without mobilizing more money. So where we need to substitute the imports, certainly this should be done with the federal money, and those plans are discussed in every detail. But the structure of the economy cannot be changed or provided for only with the public funds. People who feel that they are poor should realize that they have 10 years in order to become richer. So not Mr. Abramovich, not Mr. Vekselberg, they are affluent already. But, for instance, those people who actually were paid quite well in 2007, they could become the people of the middle class. And certainly you should not force anyone. And right now, people, they do not have to participate in privatization in the 1990s. They do not have to do something with the criminal dealings or with the criminal affairs in order to become rich. But we are increasing the employment rate. And we are going to promote the SME, small and medium-sized enterprises. And more than half of the economically active people will actually be in the small and medium-sized enterprises. This is our agenda, and we do not want to actually announce it openly. We do not want to scare people. And just like the Rottenberg law is very scary. But, for instance, someone said that we are imposing or adopting the exit visas or something like that. This is not so. There is no clear-cut program to send wrong messages, because there are a lot of wrong messages which scare people. Against the background of this consolidation and solidarity, we should encourage people. So we can tell people that wait a little bit, and we are going to develop the program which will actually help you to become richer. And this would not be funded by the money from the EU. If this plan fails, then we will have to mobilize the economy. Thank you. Ivan Krastyev. There are a lot of questions, and we're running out of time.
Listening to you, I understand that you see the sanctions as an opportunity for modernization, so probably it's another form of Western assistance to Russia. But my question is the following. To what extent this new situation has changed the structure of decision-making? You as an economist, do you believe that economists now are more influential than they were before the sanctions? To what extent the fact that you have a much more stronger public opinion, Duma, which is much more active, security arguments, is changing the structure of decision-making?
Нет, сейчас, к сожалению, еще я не могу сказать, что мнение экономистов превалирует.
I cannot say that the opinions of the economists prevail. So Lenin, after the revolution, said that the economy is prevailing and dominating the politics. So this is not so in Russia, but it will come true sooner or later. Well, and let me reiterate that again. In the political and economic spheres, there are no gaps. We are bringing those two aspects together. And it means that those who develop the political agenda, I mean the president and his team, they should realize that they have to get back to the economic agenda, first of all, in order to strengthen this political success. A year ago, when I work, actually, I usually turn to some historical things, because otherwise, picking up this topic, there shouldn't be no gaps in our remembering who we are. I actually read several books about Kosygin and written by Kosygin. And after that, I came to Mr. Putin and said, Vladimir Vladimirovich, I read some things, some failures, some mistakes which we should not repeat, and this was even before the Ukrainian crisis. And I told him at least what I understood from those memories. There was a gap between economic and political agendas. And people surrounding Brezhnev believed that Brezhnev could reach some political success personally, and it would not be connected to the success of Mr. Kosygin and his mates. And all the reforms which were curtailed in 1960s, many people were happy that these reforms were curtailed because they felt that this was not necessary. And actually, many people around Brezhnev or around Kosygin did not want him to be successful. Politics is when we discuss the questions related to power. The power-wielding people have to focus on the economy, first of all, because this would depend our further success. And so we can tell them, well, work gradually and do not intervene with our affairs. We have such an economic agenda. We have a large-scale political agenda, and we have a rather small economic agenda. So we have to promote economic agenda, and this could be done only if President decides to support it. And actually, nothing new is in the history. Everything goes in cycles. And when we were scared by the sanctions, I started immediately reading about the sanctions which were imposed after the troops were brought to Afghanistan after downing of South Korean aircraft. And what happened in 1989 in China? In China, in response to sanctions and in response to this forced political consolidation, or strengthening, if you want, after those events at Tiananmen Square, Deng Xiaoping announced absolutely free and liberal political course, and when he stepped down, there was an attempt to implement this policy, and Deng Xiaoping had actually to get back to power from the retirement and to implement this agenda in order to promote this free liberal course, and only after that this freedom was promoted. By that moment, in 1989, there were a lot of restrictions in terms of restricting and banning the foreign currency, the export transactions and import transactions, and the economic situation there was much worse than in the Soviet Union and Russia in 1990s. And they actually developed this agenda, and now they are much better off. But this decade, they actually lived under the motto that they have to fight for better economy. And certainly a lot is orchestrated there by the public funds, but they provide a lot of freedoms for SMEs. We see the combination of bringing together the public funds and the private funds, and this agenda is not in demand here in Russia. At least in the State Duma, we see that the deputies want to somehow backlash, to strike in return. So if you are hit in your face, so your first reaction would be to respond to that, to hit back. And we have to be very serious about the economic agenda, but we do not rest on laurels, and we work every day, so we collect and gather certain ideas. I'm not sure whether sanctions are helpful and whether this is an assistance to us, but we have to think much quicker. Thank you. Yes, please.
Ilmar Murtazaev, good morning. Well, now we see that ruble is weakening, and because of the dynamics with oil, what is your forecast with regards to that? And my second question is related to the first. You studied the history of sanctions and the history of reciprocal sanctions, and we know that Iran, there were cases when there was moratorium on corporate debt. payments. Well, for the time being, that's something that is not being considered. Well, that is something that we do not consider yet, because we hope that there will be common sense that will dominate, and I'm confident that neither government, that it's not governments of other countries, but people, common people that see that sanctions should not be imposed. People, well, governments will impose more and stronger sanctions, but people will support us. People will be more and more for Putin, for the government, and we think like them, and either this time is already at hand, or we're very close to that, when everybody will understand that there is no need to aggravate the situation. Although if the American administration wants to pursue certain goals, objectives, they will try to worsen the situation, but that's not what we want to do. But as for the measures that you mentioned, well, naturally we have some pack of other measures at hand, but that's what all the scenario was put down in writing in spring by the president. And well, there are various scenarios that they were all put down, and we discussed them. We had several rounds of discussion. In case of the worst scenario, we know what to do. So we have our contingency plan. But corporate debt freezing is not envisaged. As for the dynamics of the rate of exchange, well, I think that it would be better for the head of the Bank of Russia to discuss that. She is responsible for that. She is accountable for the national currency and its stability. So I believe that in my vision, nothing dramatic is happening. I will comment this as give a comment on the situation. It's just a fluctuation of the rates, and it's going in one direction, but within several weeks it can get back, and this will be even worse for our economy, I believe, because if dollar-ruble rate is below 40 rubles, I think that is just painful for us. For us, it'd be better for ruble to be cheaper, but we cannot exert any influence on that. If you believe that we can command Nabiullina saying that let's set a rate of exchange at this level, well, she can only smaller things, but we see that maybe some agitation on the market, or people are affected by some mass psychosis and will withdraw money from the bank. Well, naturally, Nabiullina can influence the market or rate through some interventions, but we agreed that we will not waste gold reserves for this. But when we observe people's behavior, we'll see that they are much calmer than in autumn 2008, because everybody understands now, we got used to the understanding that ruble will stay a highly volatile ruble, and you live in Russia, you consume things in Russian, you pay in rubles, and that's why there is no need to link your capital to hard currency.
My question is related to national champions, because a large part of the Russian development during the last decade was based on national champions, especially in the energy field. And two of them are in a difficult situation in my regard. Rosneft recently asked for a significant refunding coming from the states, and the business model of Gazprom is very seriously challenged by the decreased demand in Europe and the third package. So what does the state expect from these two companies for the next 5 years? Thank you very much.
Роснефть и Газпром. Мы от них ожидаем многого.
Rosneft and Gazprom, we expect a lot from them, primarily in tax paid. But as for the programs of development, I should say that Rosneft has a much more ambitious program. And all the programs that we just discussed for Rosneft at the Investment Committee, they have serious plans for development, but not only in Russia, but for global development. Well, we encourage their plans in every possible way. We like the way the team works. All the dark things and grey things are being taken out of the company, well, which is natural for a company with public participation. They introduce the rules of corporate culture, and they encounter a number of difficulties with that, because people are, well, those who work are used to operating with flows, but Mr. Sechen's team, well, introduced new, during the Sochin Forum, Mr. Sechin said that irrespective of government participating as a stakeholder in the company or not, he wants to make his company as a role model for the industry. As for gas and price on gas, well, natural that will naturally has its effect on the revenue of the companies for a certain period of time. As my ex-colleague in the government, Kudrin, says that, well, the price may be like that for a number of years, but we do not know for sure for how long that will be. It can drop even lower, but much depends on the technologies that they use and the fields that they explore and mine, and much depends on their partners, Exxon Mobil and etc. But if we look at Exxon as the leader in the world, I would like to see Rosneft company number one in the global respect. But naturally, we should invest more in R&D, but we have resources. We have our own developments in this field, and this is an ambition that is achievable for them. As for Gazprom, I think that Gazprom will have to return to the theme of modernization in gas industry and, well, revisit its way of arrangement. I do not know any answer to this question yet, but I believe that with Gazprom we need to see how things should be done for them so that their capitalization grows. It is unforgivably low. The company should cost much more. Its value should be much higher. It's not only because of the price on gas that they sell, or because consumption level went down. Even with the current level of its extraction and sales, gas may be much higher. But I don't see their plans yet. I know Rosneft's plans for sure, but I'm not fully aware of the plans for Gazprom. But just judging by the feelings of what I see from in the government, Rosneft can become company number one, or at least number two in the world. Mr. Sher.
Forgetting that I'm James Sher from Chatham House. When you calculate the impact of sanctions on budgetary policy and on economic policy as a whole, you must have certain working assumptions about how long these sanctions are likely to last. Mm-hmm. And you must consider some scenarios to be more probable than others. I wonder if you would share this with us. Do you think of the sanctions as a temporary phenomenon, or do you think that Russia is now at the beginning of a process of the strategic realignment of European economies?
Да, но давайте я лучше по-другому отвечу. Не так, как я думаю, а думают другие, потому что сценариев несколько. Их вообще.
Well, I will reiterate your question. Just put it differently. Sanctions can be lifted very soon, or they may be midterm for a year or two, or they can be stay with us for a number of years. Well, I was given these assessments, and so I am to work according to these three lines. What will happen with Russian economy? The sooner the sanctions are lifted, the sooner our partners do that, the worse it will be for the modernization of Russian economy. Why? Well, I want you to perceive this seriously. It's not just a matter of keeping dialogue with you, because the legal lift of legislative lift of sanctions will not give any possibility of attracting money right away in the market. When legally de jure the sanctions are lifted, they de facto will continue, but this will affect people's moods right away. But what we need is to have a certain effect on influence on people's spirits rather than on the behavior of the capital. So as that was launched, and on the large international arena, we stepped in with our own agenda, and this is something that Minister Lavrov should do. And I believe this agenda is just, and it is not a narrow interest of Russia, but many countries look at Russia for searching for a just solution of the settlement, solution for the situation. So we believe that our position is just and fair, and I don't think that Russia should look for any means or ways of negotiating mitigation of sanctions. That should not be on our agenda at all. That should be on the agenda of Europe, Canada, US, Australia, and all other countries that took this decision, to my mind. Mr. Krichevsky.
Nikita
Krichevsky, economist. Igor Ivanovich, your words appeal to me with what you said about modernization and development of a domestic economy, especially under sanctions. Well, more than once you said that you lean on the brightest economic minds and thinkers who work with that. Whom do you mean by that? And second, speaking about economic concepts that support that officials work with, what do you think about that? And please, I would like to ask for your comment on de-offshorization and financial turnover. That's your term, I quote you. And we understand that this is an enormous resource because annually trillions of rubles flow from the budget. Well, the draft law was agreed, and to fulfill the presidential instruction, and that was done last year. The government has worked on that. We delayed it a little bit because we had to agree with the Russian Chamber of Industrials and Entrepreneurs. So they wanted it to be introduced since the 1st of January in full. If we did that, that will cause some problems for industrialists, but we agreed for a transition period of 2 years. Well, the Ministry of Economic Development proposed that to be introduced for 3 years as a temporary measure, but we said that there will be some relaxed measures for the coming 2 years, but with criminal consequences for businessmen who violate it, who breach it, but their responsibility will not be in force, will not come in force not earlier than in 2 years. But we then passed this draft to our deputies, and they introduced it as a legal initiative, and I believe that by November they are to pass it. I hope that by the end of November, well, there will be several readings, and by the 1st of December, we will have this law signed, I hope. So we worked on that. As for institutions, the best practices of of Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and 2 years for starting that. As for the brightest minds, Nabil Linesh is the brightest mind, yes. I believe she is the most educated person being in different offices. She was first Deputy Minister of Economic Development. Then I worked with her on the project of national development under Putin. Then she worked as a Minister of Economic Development, advisor to the President on economic issues. So now she is head of the single regulator of the financial sphere. So I'm just trying to avoid answering your question. I believe that not all schools were presented in that work. What is our experience? When we start discussing a certain theme, two good economists are like two good legal advisors. I'm a legal advisor by my education. So two legal advisors meet and they have at least 3 opinions. So similar situation comes when we have good economists meet together. We hope to broaden our discussion in the economics theme. I regard your question as a criticism that we have overlooked some bright minds and they're not part of our team, but we will work on that. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Shuvalov. The system of transportation in Russia is developing quickly. Is there any new strategy for the transportation system in Russia, which will link Russia even stronger with Europe and even more with Asia? Will that be done, or there are some other issues that should be discussed? Well, I would say that we need to fulfill the strategy for program for development of transportation in Russia in full. It can be extended in time if we have meager budget resources, but we are considering now a project Western China, Western Europe, additionally to what we have already, with commissioning part of private roads. There will be that will be either concession or private projects, and this road will go through the territory of Russian Federation and Kazakhstan. This project is considered as a concept now, and I believe this project has a future, and that will be added to our plans. And all our plans are large scale, but they all require a lot of money. But unfortunately, we don't have these resources yet in full. Thank you very much. We have another question.
Thank you. It's Stephen Fiddler from the Wall Street Journal. You've mentioned there'll be no corporate debt moratorium, but I'd like to ask you to expand a little bit on the issues around repayment of debt, given that capital markets are closed, in effect, to Russian companies and to state entities. Can you give us an idea of what requests you have received for debt repayments and help from the government? And if the government does give this help, where will the money come from? And may some companies, if these sanctions continue, be allowed to default?
Значит, мы не получаем пока от компаний.
Well, for the time being, we have not received any applies from the companies to be subsidized for debt payments. We have certain requests from companies for money for development, for instance, from the Fund of National Prosperity. For instance, Novatech is under sanctions now, but they have a perfect, brilliant projects, but with the foreign partners. But because of the and with the contracts signed, there is no financing from foreign partners. Well, they turned to help for us. I really liked their project. So we're discussing now that with my colleagues, how can we ensure additional liquidity for them so that they can complete their project. Rosneft has a number of projects. They turned to us with a request for resources. But again, this is not a free of charge. It's not giving them. This is all borrowed capital, but on long term, that will be long money. Can we allocate funds for them to develop fields and sign new contracts?
But such volumes that are requested by Rosneft, we don't have that much money, but at least we are considering this application. Let me answer your question more specifically. Requests from companies to help them pay their foreign debt, we don't have that. We did have that kind of work in 2008 when the Bank of Russia gave to Vneshekonombank $50 billion for them to refinance their debts to foreign creditors. And we had that kind of program before, but we don't need it now. The banks ask us to create a mechanism so that they could have access to long-term dollar resources to issue loans to companies that have debts to foreign creditors. So the Bank of Russia has provided certain tools. They went from 24-hour repo, then a mechanism of weekly loans, and up to a month. Some banks asked to create the mechanism of issuing loans in hard currency or financing or providing liquidity to Russian banks in foreign currency with up to 1 year, but that's dangerous because that puts in danger the gold and currency reserves of the country. We do have such requests. We are considering this request, and we sometimes provide liquidity for short-term periods. We see no difficulties with paying the debt. But what will be the problem of some of the debtors? If their revenue is in rubles and they got their loan in dollars and the rate of course changed for them, it may be the issue of default, but not because we did something. If their revenues are in rubles and the debt in dollars, then it's possible. Then it's if it's a pre-default state and it's a big company, we're going to work with such companies. But if the revenues are in dollars and the loan is in dollars, let them work comfortably with their creditors. Evgeny Kopatko from Ukraine. Well, we are talking about sanctions, and we know that in Russia there is this program of import substitution, especially with regards to industry and its relations with Ukraine. These latest events, have they impacted your import substitution program, especially in the nuclear sphere, Turboatom, Nikolaev enterprise, and other Ukrainian companies that always had links with Russia, and now in St. Petersburg they're building something similar. What are the steps? And can you go back to Ukraine if you improve your relations with Ukraine? I am not sure about the return. This question should be asked. The president, you ask this question, ask President this question, and in terms of cooperation with Ukraine, in terms of industry, we need a system of guarantees that nothing similar would happen to what happened now. I'm not sure if this system can be created, but the Minister of Defense, 8 years ago, Mr. Ivanov, back then, and Yushchenko was their president then, and it all started. He said it would cost us a lot. We need to have started when he was the Minister of Defense back then, he kept telling us, now we need to start import substitution, because Ukraine already is talking about NATO, and we we are going to have problems in the future. But we thought that cooperation and joint projects, joint development would be more valuable than to get isolated and move the territory to move the production to our territory. But it's not that difficult of a task. We tried it with one plant from Tashkent that produced IL-76. We moved the entire plant, and we moved people, we moved designs and drawings, and we know what it is. It's not something too difficult. We were talking with Prime Minister yesterday, agreed on that fund, and the first allocations are going to be sent to be there, 20 billion rubles by the end of the year. This project is in progress, and we need about 5 years to some production can be restarted in 1, 2, 3 years, most difficult ones up to 5 years. Can we restore that? But will we continue with our program of import substitution? Yes, we will. And Belarus is trying to actually join that program, and they say they have a lot of production facilities and opportunities. They are strategic partners, and they can manufacture some of the parts. And I think it's an issue of politics, what we can agree with, what critical technologies are in the territory of a foreign country, even if it's an ally, and what we can have only in our territory. That's a very cool program of modernization that you describe. You mean cool in the sense of funny? No. When my kids say cool, they usually mean funny. And no, something broader. And I see two issues here. For you to bring about private initiative, you have to move towards dealing with corruption, removing administrative barriers, and the redistribution of sources of revenues from regions to the federal. And we have not moved here, neither in the 30 years nor during the crisis. What instruments of movement do we have? What specific instruments of movement do you mean to use in that report? Wait a minute, let me answer this one. That's wrong. You said in your question that the failure to modernize. I disagree that in 14 years we did nothing. I'm not protecting my job, but let's look at the regulations in 1999 and 2000 and how much regulation we have now. We have almost zero currency regulation. Remember what it looked like to have a currency deal back then, what it took to register a legal entity, what it took to deal with taxes. Don't you think we deregulated here licensed types of activities, more than 1,000 of them? What you say, I think, is not true. We deregulated a lot. Now, about giving mandates to the entities of the Russian Federation. You may not remember, but remember that law on removing law 122 about monetizing. We gave a lot of Kozak started that work. We gave a lot of mandates and powers to the entities of the Russian Federation. We gave them a lot of mandates, and we did not give them enough finances. And the entities said, well, we need no more powers. And when we come to them, they say, we only need two things. Rospotrebnadzor, give us an opportunity to, those are the people who go everywhere and control things, enterprises, and Rosreestr, Russian register, where they register real estate. Give us these two powers. These are the most important administrative resources, and keep the rest. 14 years. 14 years. During those 14 years, we deregulated it all. Of course, we still have a lot of stupid regulations, and we have to cancel that. And what I focus on, Dmitry Kozak is responsible for Crimea. And Crimea seems to be like a different territory. You cannot immediately pull them into Russian system of regulation, and we have created a lot of exceptions for them. You have these rights here and these, and this entity of the Russian Federation has a lot of autonomous rights, and I'm pushing everyone. Can we give other entities as much as Crimea has. Crimea is now in a transition period. Do we want to give them? Do we want to take them to turn them into such bureaucrats as we are, or do we want to already give them something more modern? And when we reach Rospotrebnadzor, this supervising authority, and we say to them, okay, give them these mandates, and then they will come and check you, and we'll all be diagnosed with plague. And okay.
Thank you. Igor, very good to see you. I want to talk about another sector, the internet, the high-tech sector, for a minute. And it seems here that while you've been talking in economic terms, that many of the goals of the state in that sector are really not efficiency or profitability, but increased control in the sense of the new laws passed about the internet and how it's controlled, and also the new law on the press, and even where the Disney Channel will have to, because it's foreign owned, I guess I mean, I don't like a lot of it, but I didn't think it was a state issue. And I just wondered if these aren't part of a larger political agenda. You talked about the interconnection between politics and economics. And so I wonder on the internet section, one thing. And then what I hear a lot here about sanctions and the impact of it. But I have to honestly tell you that a lot of Russian businessmen with whom we work with are much more concerned about the Yevtushenkov events than they are about sanctions, because this to them is really not only a step backwards, but something that affects their own personal safety. So those are two issues that are, I think, very important, because it's the connection between politics, state power, state enterprises, and economics. And then just one comment. I don't know how to say this. I'm kind of surprised that when you turn to examples or lessons, that you turn to books on Kosygin and the Brezhnev era, which most of us, frankly, who have libraries, are throwing out these books.
Я Ленина читаю до сих пор, будь смелы.
Even read Lenin even now.
I wonder, is Zastoy the best model that you could think of? Is this, because when we think about what's happening, some people comment on what's happening as that. So I wondered, shouldn't you be reading The Innovators instead of Kosygin?
Значит, дело в том, что я должен читать тех, кто
I have to read those who governed my country. You know, you have to understand, I'm reading foreign authors. I refer to someone, this new book that I'm reading by Kissinger. And still, it's what another person thinks about my country. And he was not brought up here. He has no roots here. Prime Minister Putin used to meet Vice President Biden, and he said this one thing that I'm going to retell you, and I already read it. One spy who went to the West, and he said about Russians in Spiegel, I think, in German publication. And Biden is asking questions about global leadership. And by the way, Putin also said an interesting thing there. In the nearest decade, it just happened that Russia will hardly be able to, due to objective reasons, to fight for leadership between 2 or 3 first-level players. But the result of that fight for leadership will depend on who will Russia join. And that's very true. China should understand that, and the US should understand that. Perhaps there will be a time when Russia will be able to fight for leadership, future generations, but we don't have these ambitions now. Our ambition today is to make it so that people would be well off, so that our system would be quite secure and safe. And Mr. Putin says to Biden, when he asked him about investment, climate, and the development of democracy, and many other things, and Putin said, "You are looking at us, and you think that behind us, each one of us, we have Tchaikovsky, Tolstoy, and Dostoevsky. Yes, that's true. But there are a lot of people who never even heard those names. And we look like you, but we are different, with our own combination of values. Some of them coincide with your values, and others you have to accept as our values. Only if you treat them as our values, only then you will understand how to deal with us. This was a private conversation. There were maybe 10 people total present. And when you say to me, we read all authors that can give us something valuable for the development of today's economy. We read Stiglitz and others. Why do I need to be concerned with what happened 20, 30, 40 years ago? That's a fairly recent history. They had a lot of opportunities, huge potential. At a certain point, the potential broke down, and the result was pitiful. And I'm in a period in my country where we have huge opportunities. Russians were never as affluent as they are now. Even the poor layer never lived so good. And my task is not to repeat the mistakes, because then we will find out that history lessons are never learned. I have to read Kosygin. You will laugh. We are reading about what was happening in the 80s with the Academy of Foreign Trade and State Service, and I'm looking at the closed documents that they prepared for Gorbachev and Politburo when they discussed the legislation on cooperation and property, when first changes began about private property, but it did not work out. The country disintegrated. Yakovlev, before death, said that Gorbachev and himself thought that they would give freedom to people, to the media, and immediately prosperity would start and everyone would be rich and affluent. It did not happen. Poverty happened. That's why it's not zastoy, stagnation. Many creative class people say to us, why are you imposing these values from the 70s and 80s on us? I don't think that's exactly so. And Gorbachev, even later, they rejected all the good things that were accumulated during the Soviet times. We may use what is good, and those were several decades. My parents were young, and there was something good there. And I'm not saying we need to copy everything that we had, that we should have zastoy, stagnation, but we should learn that to avoid stagnation, zastoy. Everything that the team of Putin has is the main responsibility to ensure we have 10 years of prosperity. And with Yevtushenkov, I agree. That's high degree of uncertainty. During the new economic policy, they said to one capitalist, bring the money to the bank. We guarantee the safety of your deposit. He says, yes. You guarantee the safety of my deposit, yes, but not my life. And for business, it's important to understand that personal safety and security is guaranteed, and that for the capital. And these are important things. And people in business should understand that new times are coming. They cannot afford to do what they did 20 years ago. Thank you. Every good thing comes to an end, and our time is up. And if you did not have time to ask your question, we had a lot of questions. We had a productive time, and thank you.